Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Order. Statement, the Secretary of State for exiting the European Union. Secretary David Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will now update the House on the 2 rounds of negotiations with the European Union which took place in July and August. Now, while at times these negotiations have been tough, it's clear that we've made concrete progress on many important issues. I rather wonder whether they'd fall for that. I wonder how they're going to explain to their constituents they don't care about the pensions and the health care for 4 million people. I'd like to thank all the officials who have been working hard both at home as well as out in Brussels to make this happen. Our colleagues will have received my letter following the July negotiation round, dated 9th of August. I set out the dynamics of that round in some detail. These rounds are not at this stage about establishing jointly agreed legal text. They're about reaching a detailed understanding of each other's position, understanding where there might be room for compromise, and beginning to drill down into technical detail on a number of issues. During both rounds, discussions took place on all 4 areas, including the specific issues relating to the rights of citizens on both sides, Northern Ireland, the question of financial settlement, and a number of technical separation issues. I'll speak briefly about each in turn. On citizens' rights, making progress on citizens' rights has been an area of focus for both negotiation rounds, and we took significant steps forward in both July and August. We have published a joint technical paper which sets out our respective positions in more detail, updated following the August round. This underlines both the significant alignment between our positions and also provides clarity in areas where we have not as yet reached agreement. In July, we reached a high degree of convergence on the scope of our proposals on residence and social security, the eligibility criteria for those who will benefit from residence rights under the scope of the withdrawal agreement, and a shared commitment to make the citizens' application processes streamlined and efficient as possible. In August, we agreed to protect the rights of frontier workers, to cover future social security contributions for those citizens who are covered by the withdrawal agreement, to maintain the rights of British citizens in the EU 27 to set up and manage a business within a member state of residence and vice versa, and that we should protect existing healthcare rights and arrangements for EU 27 citizens in the UK and UK nationals in the EU. These are the European Health Insurance or EHIC arrangements. These areas of agreement are good news. They may sound technical, but they matter enormously to individuals, something I think the members opposite might remember when thinking about their own constituents. The agreement on healthcare rights, for example, will mean British pensioners living in the EU will continue to have their healthcare arrangements protected, both where they live and when they travel to another member state, where they'll still be able to use the EHIC card. On mutual recognition of qualifications, we've made progress in protecting the recognition of qualifications for British citizens resident in the EU 27 and EU 27 citizens resident in the UK. In fact, each one of these areas of agreement is reciprocal, and they work for Brits in the EU and EU 27 in the UK. These areas of agreement help provide certainty and clarity for EU 27 citizens in the UK and UK citizens in the EU 27. They will make a tangible difference to these people's lives. I hope everyone recognises the importance of that. The outcomes of the discussions demonstrate we have delivered on our commitment to put citizens first and to give them as much certainty as early as possible in this process. Of course, there remain areas of difference which we continue to work on. For example, we will need to have further discussions on the specified cut-off date, on future family reunion, and on the broader issue of compliance on enforcement. Progress on these areas will require flexibility and pragmatism from both sides. During the summer negotiating rounds, a number of issues emerged in the EU offer that will need further consideration. For example, the European Union does not plan to maintain the existing voting rights for UK nationals living in the EU. We've made it clear that we will protect the rights of EU nationals living in the UK to stand and vote in municipal elections. Similarly, the EU proposals would not allow UK citizens currently resident in the EU to retain their rights if they move within the EU. Even in areas where there has been progress, more is needed. While the EU has agreed to recognise the qualifications of UK citizens resident in the EU and vice versa, we believe this should go much further. This recognition must extend to students who are currently studying for a qualification. It must apply to onward movement by UK citizens in the EU, and it should extend more broadly to protect the livelihoods of thousands of people which depend on qualifications which we gain before we exit the EU. In these areas, the EU's proposals fall short of ensuring UK citizens in the EU and EU citizens in the UK can continue to live their lives broadly as they do now. On separation issues, that's a very technical area, we have established a number of subgroups. They made progress in a number of specific areas and drew on papers the UK published ahead of both rounds. I'm pleased to say we're close to agreement on our approach to post-exit privileges and immunities, on which we have published a position paper which will benefit both the UK and EU to maintain after we leave. We've agreed on our mutual approach to confidentiality agreements on shared information post-exit. With respect to nuclear materials, we held discussions on the need to resolve issues around the ownership of special fissile material and the responsibility for radioactive waste and spent fuel held both here and there. We reiterated, this is important, we reiterated a strong mutual interest in ensuring that the UK and Euratom community continue to work closely together in the future as a part of a comprehensive new partnership. With respect to legal cases pending before the Court of Justice, the ECJ, the parties discussed and made progress on the cut-off points for cases being defined as pending. There was also progress in discussions concerning the UK's role before the court whilst these pending cases are being heard. With respect to judicial cooperation in civil and commercial matters and ongoing judicial cooperation in criminal matters, we made good progress on the principles of the approach and the joint aim of providing legal certainty and avoiding unnecessary disruption to courts, businesses and families. And with respect to goods on the market, both parties reiterated the importance of providing legal certainty to businesses and consumers across the EU and UK at the point of departure. In this area in particular, we emphasised that the broader principles outlined in the UK's position paper seek to minimise the type of uncertainty and disruption for business which we're all working to avoid. We remain committed to making as much progress as possible on those issues which are solely related to our withdrawal. But our discussions this week have demonstrated yet again and exposed yet again that the UK's approach is substantially more flexible and pragmatic than that of the EU as it avoids unnecessary disruption for British business and consumers. I've urged the EU to be more imaginative and flexible in their approach to withdrawal on this point. On Northern Ireland and Ireland, I'm pleased to report there has been significant concrete progress in this vital area. The negotiation coordinators explored a number of issues, including both Belfast or Good Friday Agreement and the common travel area. In August, the group also had detailed discussions on the basis of the UK position paper. As both Michel Barnier and I said at last week's press conference, there's a high degree of convergence on that key issue, or those key issues, and we agreed to work up shared principles on the common travel area. That is quite a major change. We also agreed to carry out further technical work on cross-border cooperation under the Belfast Agreement. Of course, as I said all along, the key issues in relation to cross-border economic cooperation and energy will need to form an integral part of discussions on the UK's future relationship with the European Union. Now, finally, on the financial settlement, we have been clear that the UK and the EU will have financial obligations to each other that will survive our exit from the European Union. In July, the Commission set out the European Union position. We have a duty to our taxpayers to interrogate that position rigorously, and that's what we did line by line. It may be a little bit of a shock to the Commission, but that's what we did line by line. At the August round, we set out our analysis of the EU's position. We also had in-depth discussions on the European Investment Bank and other off-budget issues. It's clear that the two sides have very different legal stances. But as we said in the Article 50 letter, the settlement should be in accordance with law and in the spirit of the UK's continuing partnership with the EU. Michel Barnier and I agreed that we do not anticipate making incremental progress on the final shape of a financial deal in every round. Generally, we should not underestimate the usefulness of the process so far, but it's also clear that there are significant differences to be bridged in this sector. Initial discussions are also held on governance and dispute resolution. These provide an opportunity to build a better shared understanding of the need for a reliable means of enforcing the withdrawal agreement and resolving any disputes that might arise under it. Alongside the negotiations, we've also published a number of papers which set out our thinking regarding our future special partnership with the EU. These future partnership papers are different from our papers that set out the position for negotiations under our withdrawal agreement. Our future partnership papers are part of a concerted effort to pragmatically drive the progress we all want to see. All along, we have argued that talks around our withdrawal cannot be treated in isolation from the future partnership that we want. We can only resolve some of these issues with an eye on how the new partnership will work in the future. For example, on Northern Ireland, it will be helpful to our shared objectives on avoiding a hard border to be able to begin discussions on how future customs arrangements will work. Furthermore, if we agree the comprehensive free trade agreement we are seeking as part of our future partnership, solutions in Northern Ireland are of course then easier to deliver. A second example is on financial matters. As I've said, the days of making vast yearly contributions to the EU budget will end when we leave. But there may be programmes that the UK wants to consider participating in as a part of the new partnership that we seek. Naturally, we need to work out which of those we want to pursue. We need to discuss them as part of our talks on withdrawal from the EU and our future as their long-standing friend and closest neighbour. A third example is on wider separation issues. Now, while we're happy to negotiate and make progress on the separation issues, it's our long-term aim that ultimately many of these arrangements will not be necessary. Now, with the clock ticking, to quote Mr Barnier, it would not be in either of our interests to run aspects of the negotiations twice. Last week, we turned our consideration to the next round of talks, and in that, my message to the Commission was, let's continue to work together constructively, but put people above process. To that end, my team will publish further papers in the coming weeks, continuing to set out our ambition for these negotiations and a new deep and special partnership for the UK wants to build with the EU. Ultimately, businesses and citizens on both sides want us to move swiftly on to discussing the future partnership, and we want that to happen after the European Council in October, if possible. As colleagues know, at the start of these negotiations, both sides agreed that the aim was to make progress on 4 key areas: citizens' rights, financial settlement, Northern Ireland, and broader separation issues. We've been doing just that. And I've always said, nobody's ever pretended this will be simple or easy. I've always said this negotiation will be tough, complex, and at times confrontational. So it has proved. But we must not lose sight of our overarching aim: to build a deep and special new partnership with our closest neighbours and allies, whilst also building a truly global Britain that can forge new relationships with the fastest growing economies around the world.
Sir Keir Starmer.
His statement. Can I also thank him for what I hope will be his agreement that he will update the House in this fashion after every round of the talks. I think he can agree that and has agreed that, and I'm grateful. We accept that these negotiations are complex and difficult. And I understand the Secretary of State's frustrations at points with the process. And I sympathise with the view that some Phase 1 issues cannot be fully resolved until we get to Phase 2, and I think Northern Ireland is the classic example of that. And although he won't say it, I'm sure he's equally frustrated by deeply unhelpful go-whistle comments and blackmail comments from some of his own colleagues. I'm sure that colleagues and officials in his department are working hard in these difficult negotiations and pay tribute to what they're doing behind the scenes. But the state of affairs and the slow process of progress are a real cause for concern. The parties appear to be getting further apart rather than closer together. Round 3 of 5 in phase 1 is gone. We would expect agreement to be emerging on the key issues. The last round is in October, and that should be for formal agreement. There's now huge pressure on the negotiating round in September. And the consequence, Mr. Speaker, is this. If phase 2 is pushed back, there are very serious consequences for Britain. And no deal, which I had hoped had died a death since the election, could yet rise from the ashes. Great. The second cause for concern, Mr. Speaker, is this, that it's increasingly clear that the Prime Minister's flawed red lines on such issues as the role of the European Court of Justice or any similar body are at the heart of the problem, particularly progress on EU citizens here and abroad. And the Secretary of State, the Prime Minister and Government needs to be much more flexible on that issue, because I fear these are not just examples which will crop up in phase 1. These flawed red lines will bedevil the rest of the negotiations. It is a fantasy to think that you can have a deep and comprehensive trade deal without shared institution, and the sooner we face up to that, the better. That brings me to my third concern, Mr. Speaker. We're obviously reaching the stage of negotiations where fantasy meets brutal reality. The truth is that too many promises have been made about Brexit which can't be kept. The Secretary of State has just said that nobody was pretending it would be easy. Mr. Speaker, they were pretending it would be easy. The International Trade Secretary promised that negotiating a deal with the EU would be, and I quote, one of the easiest deals in human history to negotiate. A year ago, in the heady early days of his job, the Secretary of State wrote, and I quote, within 2 years, before the negotiations with the EU is likely to be complete, we would be able to negotiate a free trade area massively larger than the EU. He went on to say that these trade agreements would, I quote, come into force at the point of exit from the EU, but be fully negotiated and understood well before then. What a joke. Even this summer, the government published position papers riddled with further fantasies. The track and trace customs idea was put forward on the 15th of August this year as an apparently serious proposition, only to be effectively removed on the 1st of September by the Secretary of State himself with the admission that it was merely blue sky thinking. Mr. Speaker, the time for floating fantastical ideas is over. No more promises that can't be met. Brutal reality. So we need to know, Mr. Speaker, from the Secretary of State how he intends to ensure that real progress is made in the September round, and is he intending to intensify the talks? Does he accept that it's now time to drop some of the Prime Minister's deeply flawed red lines to create the flexibility that he says is necessary? Yeah. And when we receive position papers that actually set out the government's considered position on the key issues? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Secretary of State.
I thank the honourable gentleman for his comments at the beginning, but let me, and his recognition that, in particular with respect to Northern Ireland, but many other issues, the future relationship is indistinguishable from the ongoing current negotiations. That is one of the problems in this negotiating exercise, and it arises directly because the Commission is seeking to use time pressure on maintaining the first part of the negotiation going as a pressure point to put up against Britain in the future. Now, let me come back to that in a second, because I've got a point to make to him. But the issue of citizens' rights, which he holds up as being so-called, well, I've forgotten what his phrase was, something about red lines, anyway. The issue of citizens' rights is not the issue which is vexing the Commission at the moment. In fact, in progress internally, that has been remarkably effective. There's one area, he's quite right, on European Court of Justice, but everything else has been going pretty well, and I expect that we will conclude most of those issues in outline, not in text, quite soon. But what does he actually want the British government to do? Because what is the Commission doing? The Commission is saying, unless we give approval that sufficient progress has been made, we will not go on to the main substance of the negotiation, the ongoing rights. And what are they seeking to obtain from that? They're seeking to obtain money. That's what it's about. Now, does the Labour Party want to pay 100 billion euros in order to get progress in the next month? Is that what they're about? That's what they were saying, you know. And the answer, and I hope the answer is no. But what we heard from the shadow Brexit secretary was a beautiful piece of lawyerly argument, ignoring the simple fact that this tactic is a pressure tactic to make us pay. Now, we are going to do this the proper way. We are going to represent the interests of the British taxpayer. That means rigorously interrogating line by line every line of the argument on funding. And that's going to be the way we're going to go. As for the other elements he was talking about, it's entirely possible. I don't resile at all from the intention to negotiate a first-rate free trade agreement with the European Union in the course of the next 2 years. And along that way, that's why we published all of these position papers. He tried to rubbish one or two of them, but let me just cite one to him. The customs paper. By the way, blue sky thinking is not to rubbish something, it's to say it's a very imaginative and forward-thinking look. But there we are. But in that very paper, in that very paper, those papers, those papers were designed to make points to our European partners so they could see what the future might look like under the vision we're putting. And let me give him the response of Xavier Bertrand, the President of France. That's the part of France that includes Calais and Dunkirk, our nearest ports in France. And he said in terms, we welcome with great interest the initiatives announced by the British government as they are likely to preserve trade between the UK and France. France, the country which supposedly is the one most resistant to our arguments. France, supposedly the one most resistant to free trade. The man who's responsible for Calais and Dunkirk said this is the way we should go, and that is the way we will go.
Mr. Kenneth Clark.
Mr. Speaker, the Secretary of State will recall that before the referendum during the campaign, the prominent leaders of the Leave campaign who dominated the media refuted any suggestion that our future trading relationships with Europe will be affected in any way, with the present Foreign Secretary putting great weight on the fact that the Germans needed to sell us their Mercedes and the Italians needed to sell us their Prosecco. Now we're modifying our trade agreement. Does he accept that any trade agreement in the modern world with any country, the EU, US, Japan, anybody else, involves some pooling of sovereignty, some mutual recognition or harmonisation of regulations, some easing of custom barriers and defining of them, and some easing of tariffs, and they always take years to negotiate or to modify. So would he, therefore, demonstrate the imagination and flexibility he's been demonstrating so far, and actually accept that during the interim transitional period which is going to be necessary before we have our new relationship, we should remain members of the existing single market and the customs union? That will greatly ease his progress to opening up the hundreds of other issues that he's got to start negotiating at the moment, and it will certainly ease the great uncertainty in British business which is threatening to cause so much damage to our economy at the moment.
As ever, my right honourable friend, the microphone's there, speaker's there. My right honourable friend has touched upon some important points. Number one, however, in terms of the ability to do this deal, we start from the position of exact identity on product regulations and on other social regulation. What worries the the European Union. So we're in the same place as them. The issue is not one of bringing together massively different economies. It's of maintaining a reasonable relationship between the regulatory structures of our country and that organisation. And he's quite right in one respect, and that is that whenever a trade agreement is forged, it has within it agreements on standards. The Canadian one did, for example. And those standards are not just about product standards, they can also be about labour law standards. The Canadian one has labour law commitments to stay above ILO standards. So in that respect, we are in the same place. In terms of the implementation period, transition period, we'll call it what you will, there is now, I think, widespread agreement across Europe that it will be beneficial to have an implementation period. How long that will be and how it will work will be decided straightforwardly on practicalities. There are three things that will drive an implementation period. Number one is the ability of this government to put in place regulations, new customs arrangements and so on. Number two is the ability of the companies, and sometimes the people, but companies, the corporations, to accommodate to that. That's the issue principally with the financial services, for example. And number three is the ability of other countries to accommodate. That's why the quote from Xavier Bertrand was important. It showed a clear intent on the part of major French politicians to actually bring about the sort of frictionless trade we want to have. So I find myself agreeing with him very largely, but actually saying to him, this is why it's entirely possible to deliver a first-class Brexit for Britain.
Mr. Peter Grant.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful to the Secretary of State for giving a statement and for advance copy of it. He's looking for imagination and flexibility from the European Union. I don't think there's anyone in the European Union with the kind of fevered imagination that it needed to think that the NHS would be £357 million better off if we left the European Union. But could he clarify exactly what flexibility the UK government has shown in here? They were inflexible to the point of obstinacy in trying to avoid any parliamentary oversight of the Article 50 process. They set their own inflexible deadline for triggering Article 50. They set their own inflexible red lines before the negotiations had even started, including an inflexible determination to leave the single market without any idea at all as to where we were going to go instead. All this has been done over the heads of the devolved national governments, to a large extent over the heads of members of this Parliament. I welcome the fact that the Secretary of State has updated the House today, but he hasn't updated the Joint Ministerial Council since 6 weeks before Article 50 was triggered, despite a joint request from both the Welsh and Scottish governments for such a meeting to take place. So can the Secretary of State confirm whether the government will now be flexible in having proper, meaningful and constructive dialogue with the devolved nations? Will he now accept that his government's continued obsession with immigration is forcing him into a dangerously inflexible position on the single market, threatening 80,000 jobs in Scotland and hundreds of thousands throughout the UK? Or will they continue on the present course, charging blindfold towards the cliff edge and relying on the Daily Mail to make us believe it was all the foreigners' faults when it all went wrong?
I thank the Honourable Gentleman for that question. The first thing to say to him is on flexibility. I mean, some of the areas I've just been talking about, the ones that matter to individuals, guaranteeing their pensions, guaranteeing their healthcare and so on, did involve some flexibility on the part of the British negotiating team, who did a very good job on that. In terms of notification, well, actually, I chaired the JMC, a number of them, prior. I don't do it anymore, it's the First Secretary that does it now, but I chaired the JMC, a number of them, to keep the devolved administrations up to speed, and indeed yesterday I briefed in detail Mike Russell for the devolved for Scotland, and Mark Drayford for the Welsh administration. Obviously, at the moment, I have a bit of difficulty briefing the Northern Ireland Executive because it doesn't exist yet. But he can take it as read that the concerns of the devolved administrations have been taken on board very, very, very squarely, and will continue to be in the course of the ongoing negotiation.
Mr. Ian Duncan Smith.
Can I urge my right honourable friend not to accept the advice of the opposition party that only 6 weeks ago was in favour of leaving the customs union and the single market, and only today has now reversed that position? He should stay steady on the course of the government. But when it comes to transition and implementation deals, over which they've got very, very excited, can I just remind him of one simple fact? You cannot have any discussion about transition or implementation until you know what you are transitioning to, and thus the agreement over what we get with the European Union comes before any discussion about transition deals.
Well, I take his point about the Labour Party. I was being quite kindly to my opposite number, the Shadow Secretary for Brexit. After all, I only have to negotiate with Brussels. He has to negotiate with his entire front bench. But he is quite right. My right honourable friend is quite right that we do have to know where the end game will be, where the end position will be, in order to get an accurate description of the implementation transition period. But that doesn't mean I'll differ in one point from him, and it's this: that doesn't mean that we shouldn't make it clear up front that we do intend to have some sort of implementation period where it is necessary. Only where it's necessary, but where it's necessary.
Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Given that leaving without a deal would be disastrous, and that the government must now realise that it will not be possible to negotiate the bespoke deal that it has spoken about at great length by the time of the Article 50 process, because there will not be sufficient time, given the rate of progress, and for the Secretary of State to talk about an implementation period, you have to have something to implement. Why does he not recognise that the only way now to give the stability and certainty to business that it requires is to say that we will remain within the current trade and market access arrangements for a transitional period in order to allow a final deal to be negotiated and agreed?
Let's start with his original presumption, that we can't achieve a negotiated deal in the period. The past Trade Commissioner, Carol de Gucht, he should know this as, in his role as past and current chairman of the Brexit Committee. Carol de Gucht, past Trade Commissioner, no friend of Brexit, somebody who doesn't really doesn't approve of what we're doing, said in terms that it is not technically difficult to achieve a trade outcome. All it requires is a political will. And what it requires is a political will on the European side to do it. And what will give that political will be the fact that they sell roughly 300 billion euros of product to us every year, and they will want to continue doing so.
So it's the mistake.
Sir William Cash.
Does my right honourable friend accept that the official opposition have not only been totally contradictory on the single market and the customs union and the European Court, but are now even defying their own manifesto and their vote on the Article 50 Act, let alone the democratic outcome of the referendum itself? In other words, they have now moved from being Remainers to Reversers.
Well, on the day that the right honourable gentleman was on Andrew Marr, saying, if I remember his words correctly, he's glad to have a unified party behind his current policy number 10, by the way. On that very same programme, the member for Don Valley was saying exactly that he was betraying their own voters. And that's what the Labour Party got to come to terms with. Their voters, more than anybody else, want us to leave. They voted for it, and they want us to leave, and they better deliver on it.
Vic Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last year, UK agencies initiated 3,000 Europol investigations. Now, with just 18 months until we're due to lose our Europol membership and our European arrest warrant and our security cooperation underpinnings, we still have no idea what the government wants to replace it, to extend it, to include in a transition. No announcements, no even mention of it in his statement today. When are we going to get some substance on this serious issue about public safety and national security? And when is he going to realise this waffle is letting the country down?
Well, I'm afraid the phrase civil judicial cooperation and criminal judicial cooperation, the matters that I talked about earlier, at least the criminal judicial cooperation relates to this. But of course the European Union will only negotiate on the ongoing relationship once they've decided they've got sufficient progress. At that point, and I've said this in terms, and it's been in an Article 50 letter, and it was in the Lancaster House speech, and it was in the White Paper, we intend to negotiate a parallel arrangement similar to what we have now, based on the structures we currently have, intending to maintain exactly what she says, which is a high level of cooperation on intelligence and counter-terrorism and anti-criminal work that we have done in the past.
Mr. John Redwood.
Mr. Speaker, I congratulate the Secretary of State on explaining that we have no legal liability to pay money above our contributions up to the date of departure, because we want to get on and spend those on our priorities. And does he agree with me that the EU has a very simple choice to make? I hope they make it sooner. They'll probably make it later. They can either trade with us with no new tariffs or barriers, because we've made a very generous offer, or they can trade with us under WTA rules, which we know works fine for us, because that's what we do with the rest of the world.
Well, my honourable friend is exactly right. And I think I should say to him that one of the things I picked up in going around the European Union countries is that actually most of those nations also understand that fact very plainly, particularly the ones on the North Sea littoral, Holland, Belgium, France I've mentioned, Denmark. All of them know the impact for their economy of no deal would be quite dramatic, more dramatic than for us.
John Brake.
Petulant references to the EU blackmailing the UK don't help our negotiating stance. In fact, they increase the risk of the UK crashing out of the European Union. In those circumstances, does the Secretary of State still agree with himself on the need for a decision referendum which would allow people to vote on the terms of the deal or to vote to stay in the European Union?
The honourable gentleman has had great difficulty understanding the distinction between a mandate referendum and a decision referendum done years. And I really suggest he goes back and reads the speech properly, because he's just wrong. He doesn't understand it. Well, if he's read it, and then I fear it's some other problem he has.
Hannah Soubry.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank my right honourable friend for his statement? I don't know whether he heard, but I was cheering my right honourable friend, the member for Rushcliffe, because I agree with him that we should have a transition period which would include our remaining a member of the single market and the customs union. But yet again we hear cheers in support of that notion from honourable and right honourable members opposite. But would my right honourable friend agree with me? That is not the policy of the Honourable Party opposite. The member who represents Brent North, in an interview on the radio yesterday, explained that Labour's policy would be to negotiate a customs union with the EU by way of a transitional period. Could my right honourable friend confirm that that is exactly the policy of this government?
Well, she makes a very good point, because she's right that the Labour Party is incredibly confused about what its policy is. But the approach we're taking is very simple. We want a customs agreement that goes with a free trade agreement. Those two things together are designed to deliver frictionless free trade. Protect the jobs that she quite rightly is concerned about, protect the economy she's quite rightly concerned about, but also allow us the ability to do trade with the rest of the world, the place where the maximum growth is.
Chris Bryant.
I hope there's a deal, and I hope it's a good deal for both Europe and for ourselves. But in order to implement that, the government is seeking, under Clause 9 of its bill, that the government ministers will be able to bring in regulations which will make any provision that could be made by an Act of Parliament, any provision, including modifying this Act. In the whole history of this Parliament, no government has ever come to Parliament to ask for that. That's not a Henry VIII clause, that's Alice in Wonderland clause, isn't it? Surely he, as the parliamentarian who has stood up so many times at this dispatch boxes in here, calling for Parliament to have power, should amend that before it comes to committee.
Well, I'll deal with that in more detail on Thursday, but I'm not the one who's in Fantasyland. This is a bill that will work and deliver the best bill for Britain.
Mr. Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Has my right honourable friend raised the thought with Monsieur Barnier
that if a member state that was a net beneficiary were leaving, would he expect to pay it a large dowry? And when he realises that the answer to that question is obvious, does it follow that the European Commission demand for money with menaces is ridiculous?
I did raise that point in a rather jocular way about 3 or 4 months ago, and all I got was laughter. But the point that I think is important here is the European Union has based its argument upon an argument of legal necessity, that we have to pay because that's what the law says. That was their argument. So our approach to that was not, as they wanted to do, make some sort of counterbid. It was to go back and say, OK, let's test that law. Last week, they were given a 2.5-hour briefing, essentially, on why we think the legal basis is flawed. And that, I think, to some extent, is why the end of that negotiating round was a little more tetchy than the one before.
Chris Leslie.
Of the financial settlement, can you just confirm that the government will bring forward a separate and distinct vote in Parliament to authorise any billions of pounds of divorce bill from the European Union? I ask him because next Monday he's expecting the House, as honourable members will see on their order paper, to vote for a money resolution which authorises in advance any expenditure, and worse, to vote for a Ways and Means resolution to authorise, quote, any tax. He wouldn't accept, would he, that Parliament should be giving such a blank cheque in advance without knowing what the settlement is?
I think he's got that wrong. The bill doesn't cover separation payments. But bear in mind one other thing we did say previously, and that is that there will be a vote of this House on the final settlement. Now, my expectation is that the money argument will go on for the full duration of the negotiation. The famous European line, nothing's agreed, everything's agreed, will apply here, absolutely, as in everywhere else. So there will be a vote for that the House can reflect its view on the whole deal, including the money.
Vicky Ford.
Thank you. May I thank the Secretary of State not only for this update, for all the work over the summer as well. I spent a bit of the summer in Ireland and Northern Ireland myself, with businesses trading across the border, looking at the papers and the suggestions on customs and on Ireland and Northern Ireland. And may I congratulate him for trying to find creative solutions to make that border crossing, and indeed crossing the Channel, easier. There is interest from both sides of the border on working on those. And given the complexity, can he update us on the question of whether or not we can move to continuous negotiations rather than monthly negotiations in order to progress discussions?
Firstly, on the question of customs, borders and frictionless trade, I mean, there was a lot of attention on my visit to Washington last week, but I went straight from Washington to Detroit to look at the American-Canadian border. And that's always been a very open border. I've traded across it myself, so I knew it well. The average clearance time for a vehicle going through that, and there's a choke point, remember, is 53 seconds. When we clear containers from outside the European Commission area, European Union area, we clear, I think, 98% of them in 4 seconds, 4 to 5 seconds. So technology can accelerate these things enormously well, and that's what we're aiming to do. With respect to the negotiating round, we stand ready, frankly, to do anything which will accelerate the process. This process was asked for by the Commission. And you have to bear in mind that they have a very stiff, rigid, structured mandate process where they draw up their lines, they come negotiate, they go back, report to the 27, and then they start the cycle again. Whether it's possible to get continuous negotiation that way, I don't know. If it is, we'd be happy to go along with it.
Mr. Pat McFadden.
Mr. Speaker, on the matter of the financial settlement, does the Secretary of State believe that the European Union is blackmailing the UK?
With the best will in the world, I choose my own words. And of course, in a negotiation, there are pressure points, but that's to be expected. Anybody who imagines 28 nations effectively negotiating together will not come to a point of pressure at some point is living in another world. Fantasy world, somebody said to me.
the one you're living in.
Mr. Bernard Jenkins.
Can I ask my right honourable friend to confirm that it was in fact Michel Barnier who described the idea of a transition period without a clear agreement at the end of it as a bridge to nowhere, and therefore will he dismiss some of the advice he's been receiving on transition periods? And can I also invite him to dismiss the idea that September is going to be the great progress point against which the government should be tested? Shouldn't we wait until after the German elections and the German Chancellor is much more fully involved in these discussions before we get really impatient for progress?
Yeah. I thank my right honourable friend for his question. I wouldn't be harsh on Michel Barnier or others. The view of what a transition period is has gone through an enormous metamorphosis in the last 6 months. When we started talking about this, us and the Europeans, European 27, they obviously had in mind using the entire 2 years to negotiate the withdrawal agreement, and then a sort of infinite transition period in which we negotiated our departure. Clearly something which would be massively against our interest in negotiating something. Now, what was his second question? Germany. Oh, right. Yes. There are other issues that play against the timetable. There's no doubt about that. The German election takes place, in 3 weeks or so time, where the formation of the German government will take another couple of months at least, probably 3 months. So that will have an impact, because Germany, it's no secret, because Germany is the most powerful, most important nation in Europe, and will have and the paymaster, and will have a big say in the outcome. So yes, there are other things. And of course, he's absolutely right. We shouldn't pin ourselves to September or October or whatever, because in doing so, you're doing the job of the people negotiating against you. And we're precisely not going to do that.
Mr. Keith Vaz.
Speaker, a record number of EU citizens resident in the United Kingdom applied for British citizenship this summer. We have 3 million EU citizens living here. Given that there is still no certainty as to their status, is his advice to them that they should immediately apply for leave to remain in this country? And if it is, what additional resources is he proposing to give to the Home Office?
My advice is almost the opposite of that. The simple truth is that at the moment, I mean, if you had 3 million people apply leave to remain, I suspect the Home Office computers might have the odd glitch along the way. So that is part of the point of saying there will be a 2-year grace period after departure, after 2019, in which it will be the time to make that application. And between now and then, a great deal of resource is being put into ensuring that that process is streamlined. He will remember, because of his previous eminent role, that the original application document was something like 85 pages long. We got it down to 16, now 6. It will be streamlined to a very, very simple process by the time we get to that 2-year grace period.
Mr. David Jones.
Another 2.
Article 50 provides in terms that the negotiations on which my right honourable friend is currently engaged should take into account the framework for the future relationship between the departing member state and the European Union. But as we've heard, the EU refuses to address that question. When he next sits down with Michel Barnier, could my right honourable friend draw his attention to the fact that he's in dereliction of his duties under the treaty, and also that his stubborn refusal to discuss that future relationship is as much contrary to the interests of the European Union as it is to the United Kingdom?
Well, my right honourable and dear friend, who used to be in my department not that long ago, knows full well I've already made those points more than once to Michel and other members of the union negotiating team. Of course, this is not within the normal perspective of the Article 50 as it's laid out by the Article 50, but we've gone along with it simply to get citizens' rights underway, that's what we've done. But now we're getting to the point where we're going to think very hard about what the next stage is.
Sammy Wilson.
Can I first of all welcome the Secretary of State's paper on Northern Ireland, and in particular the assurances to Unionists that the border will not be drawn along the Irish Sea, and equally to nationalists, there would be no hard border between Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic, and especially that those goals are achievable because of the practical measures which have been suggested in the paper. Is he therefore disappointed at the negative response from the Irish government to his paper, especially since they have so much to lose from an EU punishment bidding of the UK, and has he had any assurances from them that they'll not be acting on the spiteful advice from Gerry Adams that they should block any agreement between the EU and the UK?
Well said. I thank the right honourable gentleman for his question. He knows that I fight very shy of getting entangled in Irish politics. What I will say to him is this, that I am confident that using the most up-to-date technology we can get a non-visible border effectively operational along the border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. That was one of the reasons I went to Detroit, not so that we're going to replicate what's in Detroit and Buffalo, but so we can use some of the same techniques. Authorised economic operators, pre-notification, electronic tagging of containers. All those things will make it possible for the border to be as light touch as it is today.
John Whittingdale.
Does my right honourable friend agree that a failure to pass the EU withdrawal bill transferring European law into British law would actually plunge this country into chaos when we leave the European Union?
Right.
And does he not find it extraordinary that any party claiming to respect the decision of the British people should contemplate voting against it?
Well, he's exactly right, and it's one of the reasons that there is tension within the Labour Party now. The very, very, very visible tension on the television screen. I don't know where else. But he's dead right. The point of the repeal bill, now the withdrawal bill, is in order to ensure that the laws we have the day before we leave the European Union are the same laws as the ones we have the day after we leave, except where there has been another piece of primary legislation to replace it, whether on immigration or whatever else. And that is simply a practical matter. It shouldn't actually be a matter of politics. It's a matter of simple national interest.
Mr. Speaker, the EU withdrawal bill, as the Minister just said, is an absolutely crucial piece of legislation in order for us to leave the EU. Would he therefore agree with me that whilst people might have difficulties with parts of it that can be discussed in committee, that actually anyone who votes against this principle of the second reading is really betraying the will of the British people?
Well, she's exactly right, and they'll have to face their own constituents on that matter, because their own constituents voted to leave. This is a practical bill delivered, designed to protect the interests of British business and British citizens. That's what it's there for, nothing else.
Antoinette Sandbach.
Mr. Speaker, in the Secretary of State's closing remark at the most recent round of negotiation, he said that the UK has shown a willingness to discuss creative solutions on the governance of citizens' rights. Can he outline in more detail the governance proposals?
This is the area where the European Union's start position was of having ECJ direct effect in the United Kingdom. And what we have said is that we are a country that obeys the rule of law and obeys its international treaties, that the treaty would be passed through into the law. We actually repeat it there. We may even set up some ombudsman arrangement with a reflection to it. Those sorts of ideas are the sorts of things we've got in play.
Stella Creasy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State cautioned us to think about our constituents in response to his statement. So I'm thinking about the nearly 30 million, I believe it is, British people who went to Europe this summer, mainly on holiday. I'm wondering for them whether he can confirm today that they will be able, when they come back next year, to book their European holiday. Or is it that he might be thinking about blue skies, but he's delivering empty ones at this point?
Really, one duty you do owe your constituents is not to start scare stories.
Sir Edward Lee.
During the last 3 or 4 years, there have been very high levels of migration into the EU, particularly from North Africa and the Middle East. If there is to be an implementation period, no doubt during this period, existing EU citizens will have freedom of movement into our country. For this reason, will my right honourable friend ensure, firstly, that the implementation period is over well before the date of the scheduled next election, and secondly, that if existing EU citizens do have a right of entry during the implementation period, that right will refer to people who are already citizens of the EU at the end of March 2019.
Well, he's introducing a whole load of hypotheticals. As I said earlier, the transition or implementation period may be something which is a sort of homogeneous extension of what we have now, or it might be a piece-by-piece extension. We don't know at the moment. We haven't even got into that negotiation yet. But the simple fact is that there are a number of things limiting how long it can go on for. One of them is, frankly, the government has to deliver on departure from the European Union promptly. That's really what the British people expect, so that would fit. But also there are other issues, like its negotiability, like the extent to which, if you ran it for too long, some of the parliaments in Europe might think, actually, that's a new treaty, and therefore we need to have a mixed agreement procedure. So there are a variety of things which will actually limit the extent it will go on for. And I'm pretty clear it will be over before the next election.
Caroline Lucas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now that the Brexit negotiations are going so well that the Secretary of State has taken to calling his counterpart silly, will he publish the impact assessments that his department has overseen with relation to 50 sectors of the economy? Or is he afraid that if he were to publish them, that might just make him look a bit silly, particularly if the leak from the Department of Health is true, which foresees a potential shortfall of 40,000 nurses by 2026?
Let's start with a correction. I'm sure she's not intending to mislead the House, but on television yesterday I corrected Mr. Andrew Marr twice when he tried to say I'd called Michel Barnier silly. So I hope she'll understand that's not true. It doesn't help the negotiation to throw those bits of fiction into play. So I'm afraid that the second thing I say, we are being as open as it's possible to be in terms of the information on this negotiation, subject to one thing, and that is that we don't undermine the negotiation or give ammunition to the other side which is useful in negotiation with them. And that's what the principle will continue with.
Mr. Crispin Blunt.
Can I ask the Secretary of State whether he agrees with me that the progress of the negotiations is entirely unsurprising, given the framework within which Michel Barnier is having to operate as laid down by the European Council, and it's only when we get to October and they take a decision to then consider what the opposition spokesman called Phase 1 and Phase 2 together, that we can then begin to make real and serious progress?
Well, he's right that the mandate structure is rigid. It does make it difficult for Mr. Barnier and his team to be flexible, or as flexible as they might want to be, and that it will be the point at which the Council starts to take a steering role in this, if you like, that will matter, that will indicate the change in speed. Now, that may well be October, but it may well be dictated by other events, as his honourable friend, or right honourable friend, said earlier. The German election will have an impact. Other political issues in Europe will have an impact. And it will go at varying speeds. There will be, as I've said from the beginning of this is going to be a turbulent process. There will be times when there are ripples, there will be times when it's smooth, there will be times when it's very stormy. And we must be ready for that, because this is a negotiation which is going to be about big issues between major states, and they are never serene.
Mr. Stephen Kinnock.
Thank you, Speaker. The Secretary of State will have noted that the United Kingdom registered the lowest rate of economic growth in the entire European Union in the first quarter of this year. Does he think that the chaotic and shambolic way in which these negotiations are going may have contributed to that level of growth?
Well, I mean, I'm just lost for words as to where to start the logical impossibilities in this. The first thing is I don't recognise his economic numbers. We've got a country which has had sharp increases in exports, sharp increases in manufacturing, vast numbers of good things happening on the economic front, including the highest employment ever, the lowest unemployment for 42 years. So I simply don't recognise his rather interesting barb.
Dr. Julian Lewis.
Haven't the exchanges this afternoon shown once again that the opposition's position is that any agreement at all, no matter how bad for Britain and no matter how extortionate, is better than a clean break in 2019 if a good deal for Britain is not then on offer? So does it remain government policy that a clean break in 2019 is better than a bad deal, as it may lead to more fruitful negotiations further down the line after we've actually left the European Union?
The answer is yes, because the Prime Minister reiterated that just the other day.
Andrew Regal.
Mr. Speaker, will the Secretary of State try to confirm that if we leave the European Union without a deal, and that means that the car plant up the road from my constituency in Ellesmere Port, which currently contains 2,000 full-time jobs and has a much wider supply chain, will struggle because it adds £125 million a year if we leave the customs union and the single market, and their supply chains are also very mixed up all over Europe. That puts those jobs at risk, and that no deal will be a disaster for my constituents in the automotive industry. You know it.
I just referred earlier to my visit to Detroit. One of the things I looked at in Detroit was the Ford factory there. It's the original Ford factory. It's very historic, but it's very big, at Dearborn. It makes the car which is the most sold car in the world. It's the most popular car in the world. The engine for that car is made in Canada, 10 miles away across a border. If that border was such a problem, then they wouldn't have that factory in Canada, they'd have it in America. That's a single demonstration. There are thousands of such demonstrations of how you can make borders frictionless, and that's what we would do.
Bob Neal.
Mr. Speaker, I was grateful to the Secretary of State for his referring specifically to the progress made on civil and commercial law cooperation. But would he agree, however, that it's imperative that there is early clarity on one specific area, that is, that whatever the final outcome of negotiations, there should be early clarity on reciprocal recognition and enforcement of judgments and court orders, because unless that happens, firms will not be willing to enter into contracts for any period which runs over either the date of leaving or any of the likely transition periods that have been posited so far. It will be in both sides' interest to have that.
Well said. Yes, he's right, that's very high on the priority list.
Make Hillier.
I should declare that my husband is a dual Irish-British national, which gives me particular interest in the relationship we have after Brexit with our largest trading partner in the EU. And the Secretary of State, Mr. Speaker, talked about significant concrete progress in this vital area. Yet universally, when I was in Ireland this summer, commentators, including Fintan O'Toole from the Irish Times, talked about behind all of these delightful reassurances there is sweet, here I paraphrase, Mr. Speaker, nothing. Would the Secretary of State please detail what that significant concrete progress is, or whether his descriptions of this magic border are just a whim?
The first thing, the biggest single issue that came up at the previous negotiation in July was concern by the European Union that our intention to continue with the common travel area would impinge on the rights of European citizens, and what we managed to achieve is an understanding on their part that that was not the case, and the CTA therefore was well worthwhile preserving. We've currently got technical work now undergoing on north-south arrangements. We're going to have to, of course, wait on the outcome elsewhere for things like the Irish energy market and so on, but they are all very much front and centre in our negotiation, and not just it's very important, the Northern Ireland border. But the other thing that's very important with respect to Ireland is, as you say, their sales and trade with us, $1 billion a week, but also their sales to the continent, which tend to come through Britain and require a common transport area too. And we're working on all of those.
Simon Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. People in Middlesbrough South and East Cleveland will be appalled to hear the shadow front bench opening the prospect of Britain continuing in the single market and under the jurisdiction of the ECJ in perpetuity, which is, in my eyes, the very worst outcome that we could get. Right. Does he agree with me that that will represent a comprehensive betrayal, both of my voters and so many of theirs?
Yes, the Labour Party gleaned a lot of votes in the last election on the belief that they were willing to support the will of the people in Brexit. They plainly no longer are.
Libby Perkins.
Mr. Speaker, businesses who are wondering whether, or thinking about whether they're going to invest here in the UK or overseas within the EU will be horrified to hear the Secretary of State just glibly agree with the Right Honourable Member for Maidenhead when he said that leaving on WTO terms will be fine. Will the Secretary of State take this opportunity to express the fact that if the car factory that my honourable friend just referred to would have catastrophic consequences if we were to leave on WTO terms, and that in fact doing that will be bad for us and for the EU? Yep.
Let's be clear. Let's be clear. The aim of the government is to get a free trade agreement and an associated customs agreement. That's the aim and that's the expectation. If it doesn't happen, it's not a catastrophe, but I would much prefer it, much prefer a free trade area and a customs agreement, and that is what all the efforts of the government in negotiation are going into.
Mrs. Anne Main.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. Would my right honourable friend agree with me that given that the majority of the public voted for two parties that held Brexit as part of their manifesto commitment, it would be helpful if the party opposite came to a settled view and made constructive input into the talks that he's having?
Yes, I mean, I think one can reasonably expect some of the members to have a different view, but for the Deputy Leader to have a different view is really rather dramatic. So yes, they should do that.
Hal Williams.
When will the Joint Ministerial Committee EU negotiations next meet?
Well, that's strictly a matter for the First Secretary, and it's partly been delayed by the non-formation of a Northern Ireland Executive. We're going to have to find other methods. My intention before the election had been to go, in the absence of the Northern Ireland Executive, to a series of bilateral arrangements in the meantime. And that's why, for example, yesterday I called up the Scottish Government and the Welsh Government to brief them on the detail of the negotiation.
Prisk.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a taxpayer, I welcome the Secretary of State's practical and cautious approach when it comes to the matter of money. Can I therefore urge him to continue to press the EU both for detailed and preferably independently audited numbers before he comes to any financial settlement?
Well, we have been pressing them, but it's been more in the nature of going through the legal basis for each of the claims, because they're all set on various claims about what voting in certain budgets and certain financial proposals binds us to, how much of that is binding. But I think, frankly, the outcome of that will be that we will not agree on the legal basis. As for audited numbers, well, of course, I used to be the Public Accounts Committee Chairman, and you will remember the number of times you actually got a clear set of accounts for the European Union. I think it's naught.
Mr. Gilvin Hopkins.
Would the Secretary of State agree with me that it's entirely possible to love Europe, a subcontinent of wonderful peoples of great culture, but at the same time to oppose totally the European Union on democratic and economic grounds?
He makes, if I may say so, a very civilised point, and he's exactly right.
Yeah, it's just me.
Mr. Peter Bone.
Mr. Speaker, following on from that, it seems to me that it's in the European elite's desire to protect the institution of the European Union and not worry about the peoples of Europe. And therefore they will delay and delay, hoping that this country will somehow change its view. So could the Secretary of State, Mr. Speaker, give this House an absolute undertaking that on the 31st of March 2019 we will leave the EU, whether a deal has been reached or not, and there will be no case whatsoever of considering an extension to the negotiations.
One of the points which I think is sometimes confused is the idea that a transition or implementation period means an extension of negotiations. It doesn't. You need essentially to have arrived at a decision by the end of March 2019. But the simple truth is, the Article 50 process stops it there. That's it. That's where it goes to. So even if I didn't give the promise, it would happen.
Stephen Doughty.
Mr. Speaker, the Secretary of State didn't answer the question from my honourable friend, the member for Nottingham, earlier on regarding the money resolution and the Ways and Means resolution that he's expecting the House to vote on next Monday. Can he confirm categorically that those give him and other ministers the power to cut whatever deal they like on the divorce bill without any further reference to this House in a separate, distinguishable vote? Answer.
Well, I have to say to him, I mean, firstly, it's not in that bill, but the second thing to say to him, and I've taken advice and I'm correct on that, but the second thing to say to him is there is, because the government's agreed it, a decision to allow a vote in both houses on the whole deal.
Mr. Shalish-Barra.
Speaker, when the European Union says that Britain isn't taking the talk seriously, effectively what they mean is that they're not happy that Britain isn't accepting everything that they're putting on the negotiating table.
Absolutely right.
Can I congratulate my right honourable friend for not conceding and also for standing up for the British people? And also may I remind him that Britain's position is not as weak as some people would believe. It isn't simply one country versus 27 countries. Britain's population alone is significantly more than 15 EU countries combined, and we are also the 5th strongest economy in the world. This has to be a two-way negotiation, and the EU needs to understand that.
Yes, he's exactly right. Sometimes they have to remember that they're negotiators, not arbiters, and the simple truth, there's clearly an outbreak of deafness on the other side of the House. The simple truth is that the interests of those other countries is as much engaged in having a deal as our interest is, and that's what will drive it in the end.
Louise Ellman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Liverpool's success owes a great deal to the European Union through investment in business and support for high-level university research. Will the government show any urgency in addressing these issues, in contrast to the complacency exhibited in his answer to the question posed by my honourable friend, the member for Wallasey?
Well, the first thing I'd say to the Honourable Lady is any funding that Liverpool gets from the European Union, at the end of the day, comes from the British taxpayer, because we pay in more than we get out. That's the first thing to remember. The second thing, in terms of universities, we have done a great deal in terms of encouraging the universities, continuing with their research applications, continuing with bringing in students from abroad, and we've put various guarantees in place to ensure that. So I don't really see where she's driving.
Can I just gently point out to the House that colleagues who beetled into the chamber after the statement started should not now be standing and expecting to be called, because that is, to put it mildly, bad form. And I would have thought that the person guilty of it would know it and desist. Mr. Stephen Hammond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank my right honourable friend for his statement today, and also the opportunity he gave members of this House to spend many pleasurable hours during the recess reading position papers. The position paper on customs largely fails to mention financial services in any way, and given it's our biggest tax raiser and 45% of our exports, could my right honourable friend confirm to the House what the government's ambitions are for customs arrangements in financial services? Have they yet been raised in negotiations? And does he intend to publish a position paper on those arrangements?
The answer to the last part is not immediately. The financial services is clearly an important part of the free trade agreement we want to achieve. Customs primarily applies to physical goods, of course. So we are very, very clear in our minds that financial services is a massively important part of the negotiation. There should be absolutely no doubt about that.
Peter Kyle.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State informed his EU counterpart that he has informed and promised this House and the people of Britain that he will deliver the exact same benefits outside of the EU as we currently enjoy inside. And what was the reaction?
You know, every time this hoary old argument comes up from the other side, I say the same thing to them. I make no apologies for being ambitious on behalf of our country.
Sir Desmond Swain.
Are the negotiations any more convivial than the press conferences that follow them, which only serve as a powerful corrective to any illusion that we might possibly have remained part of that institution?
All my meetings with everybody are always convivial.
Seema Malhotra.
Speaker, the European Investment Bank is the EU's not-for-profit, long-term lending institution and symbolic of our commitment to each other's progress. EIB funding in the UK for infrastructure spending, entrepreneurship and development has been worth €35 billion in the last 6 years. What specific discussions has the Secretary of State had on the EIB? Is he committed to doing all he can to seek for the UK to remain a member of the EIB after we leave? Or does the government plan for us to leave? And can he guarantee that withdrawing will not have a negative impact on investment in the UK and on our economy?
Well, and what she failed to say as well was that actually the British economy has been more successful than most others in obtaining investment from that source. So far, the negotiations only talked about departure arrangements, so what would happen in the event of a rift. When we get to the point of talking about the ongoing relationship, I think that we will be looking to maintain that ongoing relationship.
Steve Double.
Mr. Speaker, does the Secretary of State agree that the British people are right to expect that any divorce settlement will only be determined within the context of our ongoing relationship with the EU, and any expectation that we will agree to a figure before knowing what our future relationship will be is completely unrealistic?
Well, I think politically he's quite right. That is the case, and it's something which it's a point of view which is resisted heavily by the Commission, but he's right.
Mrs. Helen Goodman.
Speaker. The Secretary of State knows perfectly well that to keep the lights on in this country, we need the electricity interconnectors operating with the continent. He's nodding, so he does know. He also knows that the legal base for the energy market is separate from that to the single market. So in his statement where he said, in relation to cross-border economic cooperation and energy, we'll need to form an integral part of discussions on the UK's future relationship. Is he softening up the colleagues behind him for the reality we will have to stay in the European energy market?
No, but you don't have to be a member of that to sell and buy from it, just as many other countries do.
Mr. Philip Hollowbone.
Hasn't it become depressingly clear this afternoon that, with some honourable exceptions, most opposition MPs have swallowed the EU negotiating line hook, line and sinker? They want us to transition to staying in the single market and the customs union, and if possible staying in the whole EU, thus preventing us from regaining control of our borders, and they are displaying a catastrophic loss of nerve at the first whiff of grape shot from the EU Commission. Can I commend my right honourable friend for his cool head, steady nerve, and urge him to hold the line and not to listen to the Ramonas who have become reversers who would sell our country short?
Well, I thank him for the compliment, but all I'll say is I don't think the grape shot started yet.
Ms. Rennie Slaughter.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday with members from both sides, I was in Calais visiting some of the refugees sleeping rough around the port since the demolition of the jungle camp. About 200 of those are minors, some of whom have the right to come to the UK under the Dublin III regulations. If we leave the EU, then those Dublin III regulations fall away, will he guarantee to replicate them in immigration rules, and will they then apply just to EU countries or more widely?
Well, he'll forgive me if I don't make an instantaneous promise on what's going to be in the immigration bill, but this is precisely the sort of thing that should address. And it's a more general point I made to the European Commission negotiators last week, is that a legal requirement is not the only reason for doing things. You know, we're a country with a strong tradition of tolerance and generosity, and I expect that, if anything, to grow after we leave, not diminish.
Mr. Ian Stewart.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If it is deemed desirable to have a transition or implementation period for a fixed period of time after we leave, what reassurances can my right honourable friend give me that during that period this country will be able to start formally conducting trade negotiations with other countries outside the EU?
Well, the basis of the limitation at the moment is the duty of sincere cooperation, which arises from membership of the European Union. We won't be a member. What I would say to him, however, is one word of caution, and that is, in the event that we've got an open customs border in that duration, if there's some sort of short-term customs agreement, there will be limitations on what can be done. So an entry into force of such an agreement is unlikely unless it's a parallel one to one that's with, let's say, Japan and the European Union, or South Korea and the European Union. So there will be limitations, but he makes the point we should be able to negotiate in that time.
Streeter and Bailey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Foreign Secretary has publicly proclaimed that the EU, quote, can whistle for a divorce payment. The Secretary of State for International Development has accused the EU of blackmailing the UK. Can the Minister explain how helpful he has found these comments in underlying the commitment of the UK to a flexible and imaginative approach, which he claims is the basis of our approach?
It just goes to show how lucky it is I'm such an amiable person.
Mr. Robert Courts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Michel Barnier has said that his state of mind is to reach an agreement with the United Kingdom. Could the Secretary of State please say whether, in his experience, the goodwill that is required to reach a negotiated settlement is present?
Well, of course it is. The simple fact is that all of the negotiators on the other side want to reach a deal. Not just out of generosity and altruism to us, but because it's in their own interest to do so. So that's the first thing to say. Second thing to say is, of course, as other people have pointed out, these are simply the negotiators. They're not, at the end of the day, the final decision makers. That's the Council, and they very much have every reason to do a deal.
Lyndon.
Speaker, the Secretary of State mentioned earlier on that one of the reasons that the JMC has not met is because of the political situation in Northern Ireland. I appreciate he does not want to go into the issue of hypotheticals, but if that situation is not resolved in the next few months, can he tell us when the JMC will next meet?
Good question. It's a question you should put to the First Secretary, who's the decision maker on that. But if it's not resolved very soon, we'll have to find another mechanism. He's exactly right, and that's what we'll have to do.
Mr. Richard Graham.
Mr. Speaker, the Vice President of the German Mechanical Engineering Industry Association recently said that German manufacturers were concerned for the future of their businesses and that the economic price of failing to strike a trade deal with the UK will be bad for us all. Given that the implication of this is businesses on both sides of the Channel will benefit from a quick agreement, both on future long-term arrangements and on the transition, does my right honourable friend agree that it would actually be helpful if the EU would start discussing what future EU programmes we might want to participate in, as well as what nature a free trade agreement might look like, in order to speed up everything for the benefit of all businesses across the continent?
Yes, he's exactly right. The reason it's not happening, as I've intimated before, I think, is because they see it as a tactical advantage at the moment. But I think the simple truth is that it isn't just the German mechanical engineers, it's the head of the Bavarian state, it's the head of the Flanders, it's the head of Haute France, I was describing earlier. It's many, many people who see their own interest at risk, and that's what will help us out in the end.
Lloyd Russell Moyle.
Thank you, Speaker. Would the Secretary of State acknowledge that the delayed process in which the negotiations are happening means that universities and education institutions are left on tenterhooks to know about long-term research programmes and long-term exchange programmes, because they don't know whether we will be still part of Horizon 2020 or the Erasmus Plus programme afterwards, and bids have to be in for the next round at the end of this month? And will the Secretary of State make a commitment that one of our top priorities will be the university sector and to ensure that they get full access to Horizon 2020 and Erasmus+.
Well, I'll say two things to the honourable gentleman. Firstly, the Parliamentary Secretary in my department spends a great deal of time with the research institutes and the universities on specifically this issue. And shortly, I think within a few days, we are publishing another position paper on science and the future that we see there. And I think he'll be pleased with the contents.
Mr. Henry Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What assessment has my right honourable friend made of IMF figures that show the EU's share of global GDP will fall to just 13% after Brexit, and the significant opportunity that provides this country in terms of forging international deals, not just with, but beyond Europe?
We don't even have to look as far as the IMF. The European Commission itself has said that 90% of the growth in world trade will come from outside Europe. That's where the growth markets are. It's where the big markets are. We have the fabulous advantage of the English language, English law, and all our historic contacts. So the simple truth is we can make a great future outside the European Union.
Mr. Albert Owen.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. Can I push the Secretary of State on the Irish question, and in particular, what detailed talks are happening between his department and the Welsh Government about trade with Ireland from Welsh ports to Irish ports? Because my constituents are concerned, and they do care about what leaving the customs union will mean in terms of barriers, in terms of customs and in terms of jobs, because it seems that the Irish government are concerned, the Welsh government are concerned. They seem to get it, but the UK government doesn't. So can he assure me that the talks are taking place, and will he or his minister meet with me to assure me that that problem is being looked at, as is the Irish north-south border?
Well, if he was listening earlier when I answered... Well, no, if he was listening earlier, if I finished the sentence, he maybe will get an answer. Now, when I answered the question on the north-south border, I said we are also concerned about the fact that Ireland's major market ourselves, but also their access to the European market through the Welsh ports, would also be at risk in a bad outcome. So we are absolutely dealing with that issue.
Rex.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My friend, the Honourable Member for Gloucester, has rather stolen my thunder. I was going to ask a very similar question about business. What feedback is he getting, my honourable friend, from business across Europe that they want to continue trading with us? It seems to me that the bureaucrats don't, they want to punish us, but the business community I speak to want to do business. They don't want tariffs. Is that the feedback he's receiving?
Yes, it exactly is. Most businesses understand the real virtues of free trade. They understand the real virtues of large markets. They understand that a frictionless arrangement is what is best, not just for us, but for them.
Ian Paisley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Was the Secretary of State as horrified as I was by the comments from a senior Labour Party grandee that there would be open trench warfare in order to block Brexit? And I don't know if that grandee was speaking about conflict on the front bench of the Labour Party between colleagues, but and indeed with the dispute over leaving or not leaving a single market, leaving or not leaving the customs union, leaving or not leaving the European Court of Justice, or indeed supporting or not supporting freedom of movement. I don't know if that's what he was talking about, but will he send a strong assurance to my constituents who overwhelmingly voted to leave the European Union that the United Kingdom is leaving with or without the help of Her Majesty's opposition?
I think the answer is we'll be leaving without the help of the Majesty's opposition. There's nothing new in that.
Karen Smith.
Mr. Speaker, the Secretary of State continues to talk about the Canadian border in reference to the Irish border, reducing the situation to a technical issue, which it is not. It is not analogous. He said earlier that he would do anything to progress some of those talks. Will the Prime Minister do what her predecessors have done and take charge of the situation with reference to Ireland, perhaps with the Taoiseach, visit Northern Ireland to demonstrate to the EU that actually this is a highly critical issue beyond the technical issue of the border?
She has. She spoke to the previous Taoiseach a number of times, or went to see him. It was the first visit abroad, as it were, immediately after she became Prime Minister. She's had numerous conversations since, and some telephone conversations I'm aware of. And last week, I think on Thursday, the Chancellor was in Dublin with the same mission. So we take this very seriously. There's no doubt about it. I don't think the Irish government is any doubt about the fact we take this seriously. And indeed, I've met myself the Irish Foreign Secretary within days of him being appointed. So we are right on this problem, and we'll get it right.
Martin Whitfield.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State said in his statement that he has a respect for the nuclear materials and safeguards, but he also went on to comment that he's looking forward to a comprehensive new partnership. Can the Secretary of State confirm whether or not he envisages Euratom continuing and us being a part of it, or are we going to have a new Euratom-type agreement?
It's one of the problems of not being able to get onto the ongoing relationship or the ongoing arrangements is that we don't have a definitive answer to that. What we do know is that we are capable, if need be, of creating a parallel arrangement. That's not technically difficult, but we'd actually prefer to have a closer association than that, and that's what we'll play for.
Matt Weston.
Mr. Speaker, I've just experienced what it's like to be the last person in a debate, and you just realise that nearly all the questions have already been asked, so I'll try and make this slightly fresh. So I'll start again.
We'll be the judge of that.
Does the my right honourable friend agree with me that exchange rates are seen across the world as the measure of confidence in a country, and that reinforces businesses and others investing in your country? Since the negotiations have started, our currency against the euro and the dollar has fallen. What does that say about how well the negotiations are going?
Just going back on that.
I'll start by helping him on his view of the House of Commons. You know, the motto of this place is everything has been said, but it's not yet been said by everyone. So he's in a good position there. In terms of his view of currencies, I'm afraid that I thought that was a view of currency that went out with Harold Wilson. You know, the pound in your pocket and all that. The simple truth is the currency lands at the level which actually works best for the country. And that's what's happening here. We're seeing a significant increase in manufacturing, significant increase in exports, and an increase in our competitiveness. So I wouldn't worry about that. We do have to worry about inflation effects, but so far they have been relatively benign.
Thank you. Order.